Hi everyone, we're super excited to be filming this video today on early assurance programs. My name is Amulya. I'm a current senior in the college studying biology and interdisciplinary sciences on the pre-med track. I'm a peer mentor and I've gone through the process of applying to early assurance programs, and I'll be matriculating this coming fall. And so I look forward to talking a little bit more about this.
And I'm Rohini. I'm a fall 2020 graduate. I majored in biology and chemistry. I'm also a PHA peer mentor, and I'm excited to sit down here with Amulya and kind of pick her brain on what early assurance programs are. So with that, I guess our first question for you would be, what are early assurance programs?
Yeah, sure. So early assurance programs, they allow students in their undergraduate career to have earlier acceptance into medical school than the traditional applicant. And so they kind of give students this opportunity to secure a spot as early as their sophomore year of undergrad.
That's awesome. Would you mind explaining some of the programs that exist in the country and which ones are open to Emory students?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are kind of two different types of programs. So one type, they allow students of certain universities to um, matriculate into their corresponding medical school. And so they kind of partner with, there's a partnership between the medical school and the undergrad. So for example, Tufts University has a program like that, but focusing more on what Emory students can apply to, there are certain programs that are open to all undergrads of any accredited US institution. And so kind of going specifically into these programs, there's the ICANN School of Medicine's program at Mount Sinai, which is known as FlexMed. There's the SUNY Upstate Medical University program. There's also the University of Florida's Medical Honors Program, and then lastly, the University of Toledo's College of Medicine's program known as MedStart.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. Can you also go into some of the requirements for these programs and how students can find more information about applying to these schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So the requirements for these programs are kind of similar to the traditional application and what kind of sort of components you'd need for that. So they include a competitive undergraduate cumulative GPA as well as science GPA. And it's important to note that some programs actually have a minimum GPA that must be met. So just kind of keeping those in mind. Other components include a high school transcript, potentially ACT and SAT scores. You also would need to demonstrate a thorough history of service, and this is through volunteer and other community service work, shadowing, clinical experience, extracurricular activities, letters of recommendation, personal statements, and lastly, secondary essays. Some programs also require you to take the MCAT while others don't, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And more information can be found on these early assurance program specific websites. So if you kind of just do a quick Google search, you'll be able to locate the websites.
Great. And we'll also include the QR codes here. Moving on, when do students apply for these programs typically?
Yeah, so the timelines are kind of variable, but I'll go specifically into them just so students have that information. And so you can apply to these programs as early as sophomore year of undergrad, while other ones require you to be in your junior year. And so, like I was talking about, kind of going specifically, so the ICANN School of Medicine's program, FlexMed, the applications open up August 1st before you enter your sophomore year and are due January 15th of your sophomore year. And so it's really important for this program specifically to build relationships with your professors starting as early as your freshman year so that, right when you start your sophomore year, you're ready to apply to this program. The SUNY Upstate's Early Assurance Program applications open up March 1st of your sophomore year and they're due July 1st of your junior year. And for the University of Florida's Medical Honors Program, applications open up December of your sophomore year and are due in February. And lastly, the University of Toledo's MedStart program, applications open up July before your junior year. So this is not sophomore year, but rather a year later. And then they're due in October of your junior year. And so just to reiterate, it's really important to build these connections with your professors starting very early on in your undergraduate career, especially because you might be submitting these applications during the off periods. For example, summer applications are not, common, especially because they're not, in your traditional junior year or later, they might be earlier. And so you should definitely plan ahead, making sure that you're both on the same page, you and your professors. And lastly, I know that I went over these pretty quickly. Please feel free to stop the video to listen back to these dates as well as screenshot the next slide, which will have all of the dates we just mentioned.
Great. Thank you, Amulya. What do interviews for these programs typically look like?
Yeah, so these interviews can be one of two formats. They're either traditional interviews or MMI, which are known as multiple mini interviews. Do you mind expanding a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, of course. So the traditional interview tends to be like a one-on-one interview with the interviewer and an interviewee, and it can be 30 to 60 minutes. It can also be in a panel format, whereas an MMI is usually short round robin types of interviews. So students can meet and be evaluated by multiple different people. So it reduces bias and can also introduce a variety of question types. Thanks for asking about that. Could you also go into what the pros or the potential benefits are to applying to these programs?
Yeah, of course, and thank you for expanding on the interview types. So the pros of these programs, there are a bunch, and so I'll go into them. So one is receiving a medical school acceptance, kind of the biggest pro, I would say, earlier than most traditional applicants, and so that's relieving a lot of the stress and pressure of getting in. There's also a lot of saving in terms of time, effort, and money for these applications, as well as potentially saving on time for studying for the MCAT if you do get into these early assurance programs. So students can also focus less on their GPAs, after receiving this acceptance and kind of have the freedom to explore other interests and enjoy their last few years of undergrad. The FlexMed program of the ICANN School of Medicine requires students actually to describe how they're kind of going to tailor their last few years of undergrad after they receive acceptance. And so that's kind of what I was talking about having this freedom to, be creative and kind of do as you please in your last few years. Um, in addition, this is a great experience applying to these programs just because even if you don't receive acceptance, you are still getting a lot of practice before you may have to apply traditionally. And there's no impact on future applications to this medical school or any medical schools if you apply to these programs. And kind of the last component is self-reflection. So before you apply to these programs, you are going to be doing a lot of self-reflection, making sure that you're kind of the best candidate you can be. And so you'll get comfortable talking about yourself, your accomplishments, kind of everything you've done during undergrad, getting comfortable with, sitting through interviews. And so overall, this is, I think, a great experience.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. On the flip side, are there some potential drawbacks of these programs that you could share to everyone as well?
Yeah, of course. I think with anything, there's pros and cons. So kind of now going into the cons. So the deadlines for these programs can be anywhere from 1 to 2 years earlier than the traditional applicant. And so when you're applying, your peers might not also be applying. And so it might be difficult to find support or find people kind of going through the process with you. So that's something to keep in mind. In addition, you might be a freshman or sophomore applying to these programs. And so you might not be aware of all the resources that are offered to students who are applying because those are usually publicized to traditional applicants. So that's just something to keep in mind. Also want to include that you're applying again with 1 to 2 years of undergrad experience. And so there might not be much basis for kind of your decision and your quote unquote why of why you want to pursue medicine. So just really important, that self-reflection component is just again reiterated and very important. And also, if you happen to struggle your freshman year, it might be difficult to kind of demonstrate your readiness to apply. You don't have, several years of undergrad to kind of show your progress. You kind of have those 1 to 2 years that you have to show. And so it might be difficult to balance everything. For example, you need to kind of come in on a running start into undergrad, kind of needing to front load and get a good GPA, start shadowing early. You're also relying on your high school information, your transcript, your ACT, SAT score. So that's something to keep in mind if you're applying to these programs. And then the last component I want to talk about was that the typical age of entering medical students has actually increased over the years, and more students are now taking gap years. So just really making sure that you're kind of ready and you're in this position to apply and be the best candidate you can be. One last thing I'd like to include is that if you do get into an early assurance program, your options might be limited. You might be kind of focused on this one school, and you might not have, an opportunity to consider all the different schools and the different options, such as, closeness to home and financial aid, and just you won't have this kind of set of different schools that you're choosing through, but you might just be focused on one school. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Thanks for highlighting both the pros and cons of these programs. If a student was considering applying to these early assurance programs, how would they know they're ready to apply?
Yeah, for sure. And I don't mean to, say this word a million times, but self-reflection, I think, is the biggest component. And so it's really important to self-assess and just see kind of where you are on your pre-medical journey. Are you ready to apply? Do you think that you need some more years to kind of, maybe potentially take a gap year, find out if medicine is really the career for you? And so that's kind of one aim. Another worded but of advice I'd like to share is that I kind of use this advice is just to kind of go for it and see what happens. I think the fact that this can only help you in the future and serve as practice, I don't see why not. Just submitting an application. So you do go through the process and don't receive an acceptance, you still have completed the various stages. You still have, asked letters of recommendation. You've written a personal statement. You've done all of this stuff, and so you will have, excellent practice before the actual application if you do have to reapply.
Awesome, thank you. Would you mind sharing what happens if a student gets in, and specifically, what are the requirements they need to complete between their acceptance and matriculation?
Yeah, for sure. So if you are accepted, programs often require you to sign a contract that you will be attending their medical school after graduation. It's important to note that some of these programs require you to take the MCAT before matriculation. And so that's very important to look into. And so it's not at the time of submission of your application, but rather before matriculation. And so, kind of keeping those dates in mind, keeping that information in mind when you're applying. You also might need to take certain prerequisite courses and get, I think, certain grades in those courses. So also taking a look at that is very important. And then lastly, you might need to submit an AMCAS application, which is the kind of traditional application. And this is just so that you're registered into the national database of medical students. Oftentimes this application, you've completed a lot of the components. So it's a very quick, kind of easy task to complete.
Great, thank you. And then just a little more generally, how many students apply to these programs and how many students usually get accepted?
Yeah, so this kind of depends on the program. For example, just to go into one, U Toledo's program, MedStart, typically has more than 100 applications for roughly 15 to 30 spots. And I know that's kind of a large number, but it's kind of based on previous statistics that are all listed online. It kind of depends on the year. They've chosen, a different number, but that's kind of a ballpark. And other programs are less transparent about their statistics, but it's safe to assume that they can receive several hundred applications. So really important to put your best foot forward. Kind of continuing along, I'm wondering, Rohini, do you think PHA helps students if they're interested in this program, and kind of what kind of help do they give students?
Yes, absolutely. So the PHA peer mentors and staff members are always willing to help in terms of providing support for these students applying to these programs, whether that be with like application materials, interview preps, advice on kind of soundboarding, like whether they're ready to apply to these programs, and just kind of going through application materials to like reading over personal statements or essay responses. So they're definitely willing to help in those capacities. The one thing to note is PHA would not be able to provide letter support in terms of like a composite letter that is provided for traditional applicants, and or like a letter packet that would sum up the types of your letters of recommendations for these programs. So that's just one thing to keep in mind because you have to be extra vigilant about getting those letters on time. And then my question to you, Amulya, would be where can students find additional resources for these programs?
Yeah, sure. So all of the information I've kind of talked about come from these early assurance program specific websites. I mentioned a quick Google search can take you there, just kind of Googling the name of these programs. I just like to say thank you so much for, tuning in. It's really nice to share my experience, and thank you, Rohini, for kind of asking these questions. And I hope you consider these programs, and I wish you the best of luck if you do.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun interviewing you, and I'm glad we got to spread this information to other students and prospective applicants.